Hello, everybody. This is a long one as far as the aim, because there's really three aims in one here. Not a long one as far as the lesson itself. See if I can get this to fit on one page here. I can find an angle of a triangle using the theorem congruent angles are opposite congruent sides. I'll explain all of them afterwards. I can find an angle using the definition an angle bisector cuts an angle to two congruent angles. I can find an angle of a triangle using the definition the angles of an equilateral triangle are 60, 60, 60. There are three little rules here that we're going to learn, and we're going to incorporate this into the next lesson. So let's make sure we know how to use all three. This is kind of the picture that goes for each. If a triangle is isosceles, it not only has two congruent sides, but it also has two congruent angles. So basically, if they tell you that two sides are congruent, you mark the angles opposite of them being congruent as well. An angle bisector cuts an angle to two congruent angles. Well, bisect by definition means that it's being cut in half. So if this angle is bisected, then this angle and this angle are two congruent halves. And finally, an equilateral triangle. We said that an equilateral triangle has all of its angles the same. And since the angles of any triangle add to 180, any equilateral triangle will have angles 60, 60, 60. The sides can be whatever. It could be 222, 555, 8.2, 8.2, 8.2. But any equilateral triangle, its angles will always be 60, 60, 60. So we're going to get some practice utilizing these rules. And then in the next lesson, which is a very, very important lesson, we're going to put those all together. So let's make it a little bit bigger. In triangle XYZ, XY is congruent to YZ. Whenever you see that two sides are congruent, mark the sides, mark the angles opposite them. So if XY is congruent to YZ, then angle X is congruent to angle Z. Now that I marked that, you'll see how the problem comes together pretty nicely. If angle Z is 41, since I marked that Z and X are the same, X must also be 41. Now, this goes back to earlier in the unit. Once I have two angles of a triangle, I can add them together and subtract from 180 to find the third one. Angle Y is 98 degrees. If there's no picture, who cares? Draw your own triangle, PQR. It says that PQ is congruent to QR. So whenever you see that, mark your sides, mark the angles opposite them. So if PQ is congruent to QR, then I mark the angles opposite them. If PQR, vertex being Q, is 94, find the measure of QPR. Well, again, it goes back to early in the unit. I think you can finish it off from here. So why don't you take a moment and pause this and finish it off from here. Okay. I subtract the 94 from 180. I divide the 86 by 2 since they're the same, and I get 43 degrees. That's how we use, in a triangle, congruent angles are opposite congruent sides. That brings us to number 5. ES bisects angle MST. Well, if ES bisects angle MST, angle S, MST is what's being bisected, which means that these are your two congruent angles. So if MST is 70 degrees and it's being cut in half, then each of those halves must be 35 and 35. That's how the angle bisector works. If an angle is being bisected, it's being cut in half. They can give it to you, they can give you a different piece, but it still means the same thing. So for example here, same thing, ES bisects angle MST, so those angles must be congruent. If MSE is 40, excuse me, woo! If MSE is 40, well, if this angle is 40, then this angle must also be 40. and this whole angle must be 40 plus 40, which is 80. That's how the angle bisector works. And finally, if it says that SPY is equilateral, there's no math to do at all. An equilateral triangle always has angles 60, 60, and 60. So that's it. That's what you need to know for this unit, for this lesson, excuse me. In a triangle, opposite angles are opposite congruent sides. So if these sides are congruent, then these angles are congruent. If an angle is being bisected, it's being cut into two congruent angles, whatever the initial angle is, divided by 2. And finally, if a triangle is equilateral, its angles are 60, 60, 60. Practice. See ya.